really nice to be back at one of these events again, because essentially each time I return to the Western Counties for one of these election debriefs, we have more elected Liberal Democrats. It's been a very happy trend, which I hope I'm not about to spook by having mentioned it. But it's also actually really interesting. I was thinking on the train on the way here that, in a sense, this area is at the heart of what's happening in British politics, but a heart of it that is mostly being neglected. In my notes, I'd actually written neglected, but given Paula touched on this point, I hastily switched to mostly neglected, because there is that group that Paula briefly mentioned earlier, those 3.5 million Conservative voting Remainers. There's a huge amount of attention on the 3.5 million or so. It's a nice quirk that these numbers are about the same. 3.5 million Labour Leave voters. And in a way, it's right that they get so much attention, particularly because when you look at issues about inequality and poverty, those people are very often at the front line of many of those issues. But from an electoral perspective, there is just as big, just as an important group, that 3.5 million Conservative voting Remainers. And this is sort of typical. We're at the heart of that battle, political battle here in the Western Counties, and it's a battle between Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and ones that we have done fantastically well, I mean just so absurdly well in the last few weeks at winning some of those battles. I mean, it actually wasn't newsworthy, the latest YouGov poll, which had neither Conservatives nor Labour in either of the top two places. I mean, just think about that. An opinion poll would come out that had neither Conservatives nor Labour in the top two places, and it didn't grab any headlines. Until a few weeks ago, that had never happened since political polling started in 1943 in Britain. And quite a lot has happened in the decades since then. It's quite remarkable just how big that shift of what we've seen. Or indeed, of course, the fun thing that, by outpolling the Tories in the European elections, first time we've done that since 1906. Those of you, of course, who can remember the 1906 election will recall that it was off the back of a Conservative government that had got deeply split over issues about international trade and how that should be handled, and they'd had a coalition with unionists that hadn't quite worked out. So there's a sense of parallel there. I'm not quite sure if we should welcome that parallel or not, though, because, of course, 1906 was a fantastic Liberal landslide, brilliant set of Liberal reforms, and then catastrophic World War and near destruction of the party. So I'm not quite sure how much we should enjoy that historical parallel, but let's enjoy at least the beginning part of it. Now, in terms of just how did that happen, there's a whole host of issues about politics more generally and issues to do with political values that Paula has touched on really well. I wanted to just pick out, I think, 4 particular things which I think are particularly relevant to us in terms of thinking, well, OK, we don't just want to think in years to come, oh, first half of 2019, that was brilliant, weren't those days great fun? But also be able to look back and think, actually, they were the start of something even more than that. And what are the things that we can do to try and help make that happen? And the 4 things that struck me are, one is a degree of luck, although a bit like, I mean, there's this quote that gets attributed to all sorts of different sports people, so I'm not quite sure who really said it first. But the idea that it's strange, the harder I practice, the luckier I get. And so I'll talk a little bit about luck, but it's not purely something that's out of our control. Organisation, clarity of messaging, and making ourselves relevant. And all 4 of those things came together in a quite remarkable way in the last few weeks. Think about luck. As I said, luck to an extent is what you make of it, but it's certainly the case that the wider political environment gave us a remarkably fruitful set of opportunities through things like this year being the potentially most fruitful for us in the 4-year cycle of local elections. So the year when things really came right for us also was the year when it could pay off with the biggest and most dramatic result, that it was this year in the 4-year cycles. That was a little bit of luck to an extent. The extent to which Labour and the Tories have imploded and had disastrously unsuccessful party leaders, again, I mean, our criticisms of them may have contributed a little bit at the margins, but fundamentally the fact that that has happened and opened up that political space for us is something outside of our control, or indeed the series of blunders and mistakes that Independent Group, Change UK, Change for Independent Group, etc., have made. Again, could have been a big threat to us. There's a degree to luck that those things happened and therefore gave us that opportunity. But of course, there's no guarantee that when there's a set of potential opportunities for a party to seize to recover, that a party will do so. One of my least successful predictions, the political future, was between Christmas and New Year. I did a Radio 4 programme in 2010, so we were a few months into coalition, and we were ready, as you may recall, our support had collapsed and all of that, and I was talking about how there was a sequence of opportunities coming up with things like the Oldham by-election, the AV referendum, and so on. A sequence of opportunities coming up in the first half of 2011, where if we managed to seize those opportunities and get good results, our political fortune could look very different in 6 months' time. Didn't quite work out like that. Thankfully, when at the end of last year I was making similar comments about this year, about how you could see a set of political opportunities coming up for us, with the local elections being the most promising in the 4-year cycle, with a Liberal Democrat leadership election coming up, with a potential winnable parliamentary by-election, and then, of course, somewhat unexpectedly, the European elections. This time, we've had a set of opportunities, but we've really managed to seize them. And the reason I think we have goes on to those other three elements. One is organisation. And organisation sounds a slightly abstract word, but organisation is really you. You know, it's all of us. It's delivering all of those leaflets. It's knocking on all of those doors. It's doing all of those street stalls. It's sending all of those tweets. It's issuing all of those press releases. And it was interesting that Chuka Umunna, when he joined the Liberal Democrats this week, one of the comments that he made was that he had made a mistake in underestimating the value of political organisation. Because a lot of what we saw in the European elections came off the back of our success in the local elections. And what made those local elections so successful, what meant that that potentially really fruitful set of elections turned out into the largest number of games ever, was all of that hard work and that organisation. And that's, I think, a really crucial thing to remember, particularly because so many people have joined the party so recently. And for those of us who have been around for a little bit longer and are used to this idea that, for example, a winning election campaign typically will involve trying to deliver a leaflet a day in the final week of the election, that's really weird to the outside world. A lot of what is required to win elections is really quite strange and almost counterintuitive. And so there's a really key task that we all have to make sure that we continue to strengthen our organisation, but also to sort of educate and involve and train up this massive wave of new members, 20,000 new members in the last few weeks alone, because that's a massive extra asset we can have, but we can't just assume that someone who's joined the party off the back of really liking what they've seen in the national media about what we've been saying about Europe will suddenly become a great local campaigner overnight. So organisation, absolutely crucial. Then the second of the three reasons why we've seized really that opportunity and made our own luck is clarity. And I must admit, I was a little bit, when I first heard the sort of bollocks to Brexit, I was a little bit, I'm not quite sure, I wonder how this will go down. But it absolutely worked. There is, by the way, if any of you didn't get a copy of the European Election Manifesto, there is a very large pile of unread, unsold European election manifestos. Now, that isn't just because there always is a very large pile of unread, unsold election manifestos, going back to what Joe and others were saying earlier today, but also because when the party originally produced it, nearly all of them were produced with a Say No to Brexit cover. And it was only a few special copies were produced with the bollocks to Brexit, because even at the time, everyone was thinking, I'm not quite sure, is this going to work, whatever. And of course, one set of those manifestos were massively successful and popular, and the ones that everyone wanted. And who wants a Euro manifesto with as banal a phrase as stop to Brexit when you've got the other opportunity there? So that slogan was massively successful. But there's a lesson for us in that. And I think it's a lesson captured by this comment that sometimes people make about, oh, it's going to be a problem if we're seen as a single-issue party. And actually, I think the exact opposite. I think if people get as far as having an issue they can associate us with, that's not a problem. That is a massive success. That is a huge step forward. Because one of the things that has consistently come out, for example, in the market research that the party has done in the last few years about what do people think about the Liberal Democrats, what they know about them, is don't know. Interestingly, Not, even when this was research being done in, very soon after the 2015 election, not I hate you or coalition or tuition fees or NHS, but simply don't know. And there's often a misunderstanding in that sense of what went wrong for us in the coalition years. That clearly, politically, quite a lot went quite badly wrong. But the outcome of that wasn't that huge numbers of people hated us. It sort of reinforced this problem, which actually we've always had, that people just had a sense they didn't really know what we stood for. And so there was a very striking YouGov finding in 2016, where they asked people, firstly, do you think that the Democrats were right or wrong to go into coalition? And then if people said they thought we were wrong, have you forgiven the Liberal Democrats for going into coalition? And only 1 in 5 people picked wrong to go into coalition and hadn't forgiven the Lib Dems. So it wasn't that lots of people hated us, it was they just felt they didn't really know what we stood for, and also because of the huge collapse in our level of support and so on, that we weren't really relevant, weren't even really worth thinking about, probably literally didn't even really notice that we were still around, given how much attention most people normally pay to politics. And that, off the back of the fantastic hard work that generated those local election results and getting us a bit back into the game, and then a European message that really cut through, that therefore completely overturned that. Because actually, if the problem is that people don't really know who you are, don't pay attention to you, that's a lot easier to undo than if the problem is that people really hate you. So that was a key part of why things have shifted so dramatically and so much for us in the last few weeks. But that clarity, of course, is something that we need to make sure that we continue. And thinking, for example, to areas where there are local elections next May, that point about, well, what's the one thing we really want people to know about us in those council elections? What's the one local issue is absolutely central. One of the things I think has been very striking in many of our council election sort of dramatic successes in the last few years, particularly where we've say, ousted another party from control of the council, is quite often the issue is not necessarily an issue that is massive in its own right, but it's an issue that is very symbolic more widely. So things like about a bungled and expensive refurbishment of the town hall. When you then look at the amount of money involved compared to the overall council budget, it might not necessarily be a huge proportion, but it really powerfully symbolises a whole set of broader points, and that's the thing that people associate with us, the opposition to that sort of waste. And obviously the issues are varied in different places, but that need for continued clarity of message, and not to think that, oh, hurrah, now people are paying attention to us, let's talk about 38 different things. We're really lucky if people associate even one thing with us. And then the final point, which I've touched on a little bit in talking about organisation and clarity, is just being relevant again to people. And it is so easy to overestimate how much attention people pay to politics. And it continues to be my favourite opinion poll finding, YouGov, May 2017, late May 2017. So Theresa May had called the general election. She and Jeremy Corbyn were all over the news day after day, week after week. And remember, one of the problems political pollsters have is that, if anything, the people they poll are more interested in politics than the public as a whole, and that's one of the reasons why sometimes they've got results a bit wrong. So, late May 2017, people willing to do a political poll from YouGov, 1 in 5 of them couldn't name the leader of the Conservative Party. Now, that's not because they're stupid. It's just because most people, most of the time, don't pay that much attention to politics. Most people will be utterly horrified at my current level of knowledge of popular music. In fact, I think I would struggle. I would struggle. In fact, I am pretty confident that even if you held a gun to my head, I would not be able to name any song in the top 40. That's not because I'm stupid. It's just my taste in music is stalled in about 1989. And I'm therefore, in that sense, woefully ignorant. But not out of stupidity, so please don't hold that too much against me. But that's very similar to people's knowledge of politics. So this idea that actually people didn't really think about us, weren't really aware about us, that's the reality, the horrible squeeze that we faced. And we've now managed to make ourselves very relevant again. And I think there's a quote from the American sort of columnist and journalist Walter Lippmann that captured this point really nicely, where he said, wrote a few decades ago, the public, in an election and in politics, it's like the public arrive in the middle of the third act and leave before the last curtain, staying just long enough perhaps to decide who is the hero and who is the villain. And it's that brief little moment of attention that we really have to grab to make them feel relevant. And that's obviously what we did so successfully in the European elections, and why so many of the people who decided in the last few days of the campaign chose us, because we had made ourselves relevant as the credible Remain option in a way that, for example, Change UK quite spectacularly had failed to do. So if the challenge for us now is how do we sort of maintain and extend those benefits of organisation and clarity and relevance, some of that obviously are good questions for the two would-be new party leaders, for Joe and for Ed, but they're also things that very easily match over to what we can do in all of our local parties. That question about organisation, now is by far the best time ever to be recruiting members to the party. And there's brilliant stuff that's being done online and by the party centrally, but where local parties are really going at it to recruit members locally, we can get so many more members in. And of course, if you recruit a member locally, you get a much bigger slug of the membership subs for the first 3 years, I believe it is now. But a real benefit then of also having those extra people to come to events, to go out canvassing, to get involved in stuff. Huge opportunity there. And of course also with the registered supporter scheme the party now has, that if people are not quite willing to join, maybe that's slightly a step too far for them, we've got something else to sign them up to. In terms of the question about clarity, I sort of touched on that a little bit. We're talking about some council messaging, is I think we almost don't, we love talking about policy, but we tend not to spend that much time talking about messaging. And I think thinking about, particularly if you've got local elections in your patch next May, thinking really hard about what's that one thing that we want voters to know about us that's going to be the local version of bollocks to Brexit that will really win over votes for us. That really, effort put in over the summer and the autumn to get that thinking right will repay huge, massive dividends. And then in terms of relevance, I mean, part of the battle for relevance is just week by week with council by-elections, and indeed, as is very likely, when parliamentary by-elections happen, such as in Brecon and Radnor. So there's a huge opportunity there. If you've got council by-elections in your own patch, obviously we all sort of know to take them reasonably important, but even more important, to go and help or to do telephoning for or to make donations towards those council by-elections that are happening elsewhere. Because even if the council by-election is at the other end of the country, a good result in that is part of what makes us more relevant and keeps us in the media and the public's eye week by week. And double down on that when it comes to the Brecon parliamentary by-election. There's still lots of campaigning to do to try and make sure that the recall petition goes through, and then we've got a very winnable parliamentary by-election if we're successful at that. And one of the patterns from the past, actually the one thing that's been unusually missing in our recovery and resurgence so far this year has been winning a parliamentary by-election, because in the past, think about late 80s, early 90s, think about the early 1970s, think about the mid-80s. Normally, winning parliamentary by-elections has been one of the key elements in fueling those sorts of recoveries. Well, okay, we may have had our recovery first, but we can make that recovery all the more effective if we can get back into winning parliamentary by-elections. So Brecon and Radnor is a massively important opportunity to make sure we get a parliamentary by-election and then we win it. All the more so, given the number of votes in Parliament that have been really close on issues to do with Brexit. Who knows whether there will be another vote where one MP, one way or another, would swing it. But certainly that has been the case so far, that getting an extra Liberal Democrat MP would be fantastically good, not just for ourselves, but also for the reason why we're in politics, for being able to win more votes in the places where political power is allocated and decisions are made. Because if we can do that, we can not just have a slogan about demanding better, but we can actually achieve far more. Thank you.
Good.